Thank you, David. I'm thrilled to be here at the National Archives, to be back here, I should say. I've written 3 books, and I've researched all of them at the National Archives. It's a place with buried treasures all over it. They've got a lot of boxes here, boxes filled with little folders filled with papers, and there are a lot of stories hidden in those papers. In fact, if you get really quiet and you listen really closely, you just might hear somebody take a piece of paper out of a box upstairs and read it and go, "Holy cow!" You don't have those holy cow experiences all that often, but when they come, it's really a thrill for a researcher, and it's what keeps researchers going. So this book exists today because I gave in to one of those deep, dark desires that lurks in the depths of the human soul. I refer to the desire to prove that your boss is full of baloney. This happened in 2010. I was hired as an editor at American History magazine, and I immediately made a suggestion to the honcho of the place who had just hired me. I said, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War is coming up. Why don't we take a couple pages in each issue and run a newspaper story about some event in the Civil War that happened 150 years ago? I thought it was a pretty good idea. Apparently he didn't. He said, well, that would be a good idea, but Civil War journalism was really lousy. And I thought to myself, you know, I used to be a reporter, and I couldn't imagine that all the reporters covering the Civil War had somehow missed the biggest story in American history. And I thought to myself, this guy's full of baloney. But I didn't know. I wasn't sure, so I checked it out. I went to the library, and I took out a couple books on Civil War journalism. And I found out that a lot of Civil War journalism was really lousy. And some was really great, and most was mediocre, sort of like today's journalism. But more importantly, I came across a synopsis of what seemed like a really great story about 2 reporters for the New York Tribune who covered the Civil War. Their names were Junius Browne and Albert Richardson. And one night in May of 1863, they were desperately trying to catch up to General Grant's army, which was outside Vicksburg, ready to attack Vicksburg. These 2 reporters, Junius and Albert, got on a barge that was going down the Mississippi filled with bales of hay for Grant's horses. The barge set out at night so the Confederates wouldn't see it, but unfortunately it was a night with a full moon, and it was really quite visible, and the Confederates fired cannons at it. One of the shells hit the barge, exploded, killed about a dozen Union soldiers, set the hay on fire, and Junius and Albert jumped into the river and attempted to float away. But the Confederates sent out boats and captured them and imprisoned them in various prisons for the next 20 months. And then they escaped from a prison in Salisbury, North Carolina, and with the help of slaves and pro-Union bushwhackers, walked 300 miles over the Appalachians to the Union lines. So I read this, which is only about as long as what I've just said, and I thought to myself, wow, that would make a great movie. Unfortunately, I don't make movies, but occasionally I do write books. So I thought, well, should I write a book about these guys? I suppose if I was a novelist, that little synopsis would have been enough, and I just could have made up the rest. But I write history, not fiction, so I had to do what nonfiction writers do in such circumstances, which is do some research and find out if there are enough facts available to tell the story. So I did a little research and learned that, yes, indeed, fortunately for me, there were such facts. There were memoirs and letters and diaries and newspaper stories, some of them written by Junius and Albert, and some written by others who shared part of their story. All I had to do was dig them out of various archives in various places in America, including right here at the National Archives. And that was great because that enabled me to have that great holy cow experience as I picked papers out of boxes. So I wrote this book. It's called Junius and Albert's Adventures in the Confederacy because it's an adventure story. It's the kind of straightforward adventure story that keeps you awake late at night, wondering what's going to happen next. Are these guys going to make it home? Or are they going to get shot or hung or otherwise detained on the way? But it's also a work of history, and I think it illuminates parts of the Civil War that most people don't know about. The culture of reporters in the Civil War, what it was like in Confederate prisons, and most importantly, the guerrilla war that was fought by pro-Union folks in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee and Virginia. So the story has many colorful characters, but of course the main characters are Junius, Browne, and Albert Richardson. They were both 27 years old when the war began. They were best friends, but they were very different. Albert Richardson was a big, strapping, handsome farm boy from Massachusetts. He grew up on a farm, but he hated farming. He was a romantic young fellow who wanted to be an explorer of the American West. So as a teenager, he headed west, and when he got to Cincinnati, he took a job as a newspaper reporter. As it happened, he was a great natural reporter. He had the reporter's ability to attract people to him and make them want to talk to him, want to tell him things. During the war, he managed to hobnob with ordinary soldiers and escaped slaves and generals and even President Lincoln. He also attracted women, and when he was in Cincinnati, he started dating a young bookstore clerk named Mary Lou Pease. She soon got pregnant, so they got married, and when Albert was captured, he was married with 3 children, and his wife was pregnant with a 4th. Junius was very different. Junius was kind of a scrawny, gawky, prematurely bald guy with jug ears. He was a rich kid, son of a Cincinnati banker. He was sent to St. Xavier College in Cincinnati, which was a very rigorous Jesuit school where he learned to speak ancient Greek, Latin, and French. He thought of himself as an intellectual and a philosopher. In fact, one of his favorite pastimes was to read works of philosophy in ancient Greek or French or Latin. His friend Albert used to kid him about that practice. Junius was not a particularly good natural reporter. He was too shy, and he would basically stand aside from things and watch them, and then sit down and write these kind of flowery literary essays about what he had seen, complete with a lot of quotes from ancient writers. And that was actually that was a pretty common practice in those days in journalism. It was much more flowery and purple prose than we have now. So these two guys covered the Civil War for the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's paper. Sometimes they traveled together. Sometimes they traveled apart with different armies. They were always looking for an army that was about to go into battle, which was hard to predict. Albert was kind of better at figuring that out than Junius. Between them, they covered the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and many of the naval battles along the Mississippi. The first battle they covered was the Battle of Fort Henry. They were in Cairo, Illinois, and hitched a ride with General Grant as he put his army on a bunch of ships sailing down the Tennessee River to attack Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. So I thought I would read a little passage about that. Browne and Richardson went ashore with Grant's troops, slogging through swampy, flooded woods. Browne accompanied the soldiers on their march, while Richardson climbed a tall oak tree on the riverbank.